York, this is Democracy Now!
I don't see any protests. I did see a small protest today when I came, very small. So a lot of it is fake news.
In fact, thousands took to the streets of London to protest President Trump's state visit, which wraps up today on the eve of the 75th anniversary of D-Day. We'll go to England for the latest. Then, as Trump threatens a 5% tariff on all Mexican imports to go up to 25% by October, Senate Republicans appear poised to block him.
Most of us hope that this Mexican delegation that's come up here and discussed the challenges at the border and what the Mexicans might be able to do to help us more than they have will be fruitful, and that these tariffs will not kick in.
We'll look at the Trump administration's deadly treatment of transgender asylum seekers, and then turn to Dallas, where the third black transgender woman has been killed in less than a year.
The Dallas Police Department has reached out to the FBI because, as we know, this is the second individual who is transgender who is deceased in our community, and we are concerned.
8 black trans women have been murdered in the United States this year. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A possible standoff is brewing between Republican Senate leaders and President Trump as Republican senators have come out against Trump's tariff threat to Mexico over what he claims is Mexico's failure to stem the flow of Central American migrants to the United States. On Tuesday, Trump doubled down, saying the 5% tariff on all Mexican goods, which would increase every month until it hits 25%, would likely take effect Monday. Negotiations are taking place in Washington, D.C. today between Mexican and U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Vice President Mike Pence. Mexico's push for talks to settle the issue has not yet indicated if or how they might retaliate with their own tariffs. Republican senators are reportedly considering blocking Trump from going ahead with the move, including stopping a potential new national emergency declaration from the president. Trump said in response it would be foolish for Republicans to block the tariffs. We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. The House has passed the DREAM and Promise Act, paving a path to citizenship for 2.5 million undocumented young people or those with temporary immigration status. The legislation was passed after years of grassroots organizing. In a statement celebrating the bill's passage, the immigrant youth-led organization United We Dream urged the Senate to pass the act, adding, quote, "We refuse to use our safety as bargaining chips to build up the deportation force and put other communities at risk. We will keep fighting for permanent protection and reject any proposals to grow Trump's deportation force and anti-immigrant agenda," they said. The White House has indicated it will veto the bill, even if the Republican-controlled Senate passes it. Reports emerged this week of a failed attempt to reunite separated migrant families in Texas last July, which saw 37 migrant children spend up to 39 hours waiting in a van to see their parents. The 37 children were between 5 and 12 years old. Most of them spent at least 23 hours in the van during one of the hottest months of the year. Emails obtained by NBC from BCFS Health and Human Services, the government contractor responsible for transporting the children, reveal a lack of proper planning by Immigration and Customs Enforcement and senior officials at the Department of Health and Human Services. In Britain, during a joint news conference with Prime Minister Theresa May Tuesday, President Trump laid out plans for a post-Brexit trade deal, saying the U.S. should have access to all sectors of the British economy, including the National Health Service, although he later walked back his comments about the NHS in an interview with Piers Morgan. Massive anti-Trump protests rocked London since Trump's arrival, though Trump told reporters this week he saw great love on the streets and that protesters formed a very small group of people, so it was fake news, he said. Tens of thousands of people are estimated to have taken to the streets. Trump is joining Queen Elizabeth in Portsmouth, England today for a commemoration ceremony on the eve of the 75th anniversary of D-Day, the Allied invasion of Western Europe in 1944. Other dignitaries joining the ceremony include German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron, and Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, among others. In Sudan, the number of people killed since a deadly raid on a protest camp Monday morning has risen to 60, according to doctors who've been taking part in the ongoing anti-government uprising. The UN has condemned the use of excessive force by military and security forces, but a Security Council bid to condemn the killings was reportedly blocked by China and Russia. The ruling military transitional government said today it was open to new talks with opposition groups after it announced earlier this week it was canceling negotiations and called for elections within 9 months. The opposition rejected the plan because it would allow the military to oversee the elections. They're calling instead for 3 years of a civilian-led transitional authority. In Dallas, Texas, rescue workers recovered the body of 26-year-old Shana Lindsay from a lake on Saturday. The apparent homicide of Lindsay, a black transgender woman, came just 2 weeks after the fatal shooting of another trans woman of color in Dallas, Malaysia Booker. This is the third recorded murder of a transgender woman of color in Dallas since October, and the eighth known black transgender woman to be killed so far this year. We'll have more on this later in the broadcast. In Virginia, Democratic Governor Ralph Northam said Tuesday he'll convene a special session in the Republican-controlled legislature to implement new gun control measures in the wake of last Friday's mass shooting that saw 12 people die, plus the gunman at a municipal building in Virginia Beach. It was the deadliest mass shooting so far this year. Northam says he'll call for laws including universal background checks, a ban on assault weapons, and greater local authority to regulate firearms.
This weekend's tragedy, as well as the tragedies that happen every day across Virginia, must instill in us a new level of urgency to act. I will be asking for votes and laws, not thoughts and prayers.
In Florida, police arrested the former Broward County Sheriff's deputy who was responsible for security at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, at the time of last year's mass shooting. Scott Peterson was charged with 11 counts, including felony child neglect. Shortly after the February 14, 2018 massacre in which 17 students, staff, and teachers were killed, Peterson came under fire for his apparent inaction as the shooting unfolded. Footage was released of Peterson positioned outside the school, where he remained for over 45 minutes as approximately 75 gunshots went off inside. The White House has directed former Communications Director Hope Hicks and former Chief of Staff to Don McGahn, Annie Donaldson, to defy congressional subpoenas for documents and testimony related to their time in the White House. The House Judiciary Committee is investigating Trump's potential obstruction of justice, corruption, and abuse of power. Hope Hicks has, however, reportedly agreed to hand over documents from Trump's 2016 campaign. In the Midwest, residents and farmers are grappling with record flooding as torrential rains in recent weeks have led to overflowing of the Arkansas, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers. According to NASA Earth Observatory data, the past year has been the country's wettest since modern record-keeping began. At least 3 people have been killed and tens of thousands have been displaced. In Albany, New York, public advocate Jumaane Williams was arrested Tuesday in the state capitol after he joined a protest demanding the passage of reforms to New York's rent regulations before they expire on June 15th. Protesters called for universal rent control and reinforced tenant protections against evictions during a Housing Justice for All protest outside Governor Andrew Cuomo's office. In Northern California, police arrested nearly 100 people after animal rights activists carried out a rescue mission and protest at the Reichert Duck Farm, which they accuse of engaging in animal torture. Activists freed dozens of ducks while some locked themselves by the neck onto the slaughter line. Activists are demanding authorities investigate the Petaluma factory and slaughterhouse. Award-winning investigative journalist, co-founder of The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald, praised the action, tweeting, "The real criminality is the systemic torture and slaughter of billions of animals in the cruelest, filthiest, most sadistic conditions. It breaks multiple laws, but the police protect the corporate criminals and instead arrest those saving lives, Greenwald said. In Oregon, a federal court heard arguments Tuesday in Juliana versus United States, a historic climate lawsuit against the U.S. government brought by 21 young people who accuse the government of failing to take necessary action to cut fossil fuel emissions and protect the youth from the devastating effects of climate change. The suit was originally filed against the Obama administration in 2015. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals will decide whether the youth plaintiffs can go to trial against the Trump administration. This is 11-year-old Levi, who's the youngest plaintiff in the suit, addressing crowds gathered in support after Tuesday's hearing.
I am still a kid. My constitutional rights are being violated even more than older people who won't be around to see the effects of climate change. And we only have a little time left to put a science-based climate recovery plan into place. A plan that will return CO2 levels to less than 350 parts per million and limit global warming to 1 degree Celsius before it is too late.
And the Trump administration announced it's ending the people-to-people program for travel to Cuba, the most popular way for Americans to visit Cuba, in spite of the embargo through organized group trips. Private cruises to the island will also be banned. According to a statement by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, the ban is in retaliation for Cuba, quote, providing a communist foothold in the region and propping up U.S. adversaries in places like Venezuela and Nicaragua, unquote. The president of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, responded to the news by saying, quote, Cuba will not be frightened or distracted with new threats and restrictions. Work, creativity, efforts, and resistance is our response. They haven't been able to suffocate us. They won't be able to stop us, the Cuban president said. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin today's show in the United Kingdom, where President Trump met with Prime Minister Theresa May on his second day of a state visit Tuesday to discuss Brexit and a future trade deal. While protests rocked London, in a wide-ranging press conference, President Trump laid out plans for a post-Brexit deal with the United Kingdom, saying the U.S. should have access to all sectors of the British economy, including the National Health Service.
Look, I think everything with the trade deal is on the table. When you're dealing in trade, everything's on the table. So NHS or anything else, or a lot more than that.
Trump's comments sparked outrage in the UK, including from Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn and Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, who tweeted, quote, my view is clear. Scotland's national health system is not and must never be on the table in a trade negotiation with President Trump or anyone else for that matter. Trump later walked back his comments in an interview with British media personality Piers Morgan.
I don't see it being on the table. Somebody asked me a question today, and I say everything's up for negotiation because everything is. But I don't see that being. That's something that I would not consider part of trade. That's not trade.
Trump also praised Theresa May's handling of Brexit. May is scheduled to resign her post on Friday after repeated failed attempts to strike a Brexit deal. This is Theresa May addressing reporters Tuesday.
I think the important thing is we deliver Brexit, and once we're out of the European Union, we will be able to do what we've been talking about today and develop not just that free trade agreement, but a broader economic partnership into the future.
Among those who may replace Prime Minister May after she leaves office Friday is far-right former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, whom Trump has repeatedly praised, telling the Sun newspaper before his visit that Johnson would be an excellent choice for the next prime minister. Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn responded to Trump's comments, saying, quote, President Trump's attempt to decide who will be Britain's next prime minister is an entirely unacceptable interference in our country's democracy. Trump said Tuesday he turned down a request to meet with Corbyn during a state visit. Instead, Corbyn joined thousands of demonstrators in the streets to protest Trump's state visit.
So I say to our visitors that have arrived this week, think on, please, about a world that is one of peace and disarmament, is one of recognizing the values of all people, is a world that defeats racism, defeats misogyny, defeats the religious hatreds that are being fueled by the far right in politics, in Britain, in Europe and the United States.
Trump called the protests against him fake news.
I don't see any protests. I did see a small protest today when I came, very small. So a lot of it is fake news.
In fact, the protests against the president greatly overwhelmed any well-wishers in London this week. Anti-Trump demonstrators have been flying a 20-foot-long giant baby Trump blimp to protest the president. Trump joined Queen Elizabeth in Portsmouth, England today for a commemoration ceremony on the eve of the 75th anniversary of D-Day, the Allied invasion of Western Europe in 1944. Other dignitaries at the ceremony include German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron, and Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, among others. For more, we're going to Cambridge, England, where we're joined by Priya Gopal, University Lecturer in the Faculty of English at the University of Cambridge. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Professor Gopal. Can you start off by responding to President Trump saying the protests were very minor, they were, in fact, fake news, far outnumbered by the supporters who apparently, he said, were gathered, apparently thousands and thousands of them to greet him?
That's an outright lie. It's not something we're very surprised coming from President Trump. But as you said in the lead up to this bit, 75,000 protesters were out in London alone on the middle of the day, on a working day, Tuesday. It was a rainy day, and despite that, the BBC and all the other outlets here have accepted that there were several thousand protesters and very, very few Trump supporters. So what Trump has told his listeners in the United States is exactly the opposite of what was the case. And remember, there were also protests in other cities on a much smaller scale, but London alone had 75,000 protesters. So that is just simply an untruth.
And Priya Gopal, I'd like to ask you about a comment. President Trump has said that Britain should refuse to pay the nearly $50 billion Brexit bill and just walk away if the country doesn't get what it wants from the EU. But I'm wondering if you could talk, in the United States, there hasn't been much attention paid to the national divisions within the United Kingdom over Brexit, with both England and Wales overwhelmingly supporting leaving Brexit, whereas Scotland and Northern Ireland are overwhelmingly opposed. What the danger to the actual existence of the United Kingdom might be as a result of this continuing division over what to do with Brexit.
Well, one of the useful things about Trump's visit is it has made these divisions very, very clear in this country once again. What we've seen is the horrific sight of the current government, senior ministers in the current government groveling and scraping before Trump. And you have seen opposition leaders, including Nicola Sturgeon, making very clear that Trump's views on post-Brexit Britain are unacceptable. The discussion around the NHS is a very good example. We do know that if there is a trade deal with the United States post-Brexit, then, as Trump said, everything is up for negotiation, including the NHS. His backtracking is not to be taken seriously. What is to be taken seriously is that Brexit is precisely about breaking up and selling off parts of the United Kingdom, particularly its public services. Now in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, and indeed in parts of England and Wales, there is going to be tremendous resistance to this. Across party lines, people value the National Health Service, and the idea that it can be broken up and sold off piecemeal to US investors and privatizers, I think genuinely does worry many people. And even Tory politicians who've gone out of their way to be welcoming and I would say, frankly, sycophantic to Trump have had to pull back and say, well, regardless of what he says, the NHS is not up for sale. So Brexit does pose a very great danger, both to the public services of the United Kingdom and to the existence of the United Kingdom. We know that there is talk now of an independence reference once again in Scotland, and Scotland is overwhelmingly Remain, and there is no reason that they should be part of the English nationalist project that Brexit ultimately is. And Trump's visit has absolutely made these divisions very, very stark once again.
President Trump has both expressed his support for Nigel Farage as well as Boris Johnson. He also criticized Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, who he called a negative force. He said if Corbyn were to become prime minister, he may not share intelligence with him. Your response, Professor Gopal?
I mean, this is clearly unacceptable. On the one hand, there is all this talk of a special relationship. And in fact, we really need to be asking what exactly the special relationship means. But if the people who talk the talk of a special relationship are sincere, and Trump is one of the people who uses this phrase, then it seems extraordinary to say that you will not work with the elected prime minister of the United Kingdom because you don't happen to agree with the choice that that the British electorate made. So that strikes me as extremely unprofessional and, in a sense, really out of line. You cannot refuse to work with an elected leader. Trump's supporters, including the Tory members of the Tory government, have been saying that it is wrong to protest Trump because he's an elected leader. So by that same token, it is wrong for Trump to say that he won't work with an elected leader. I should make very clear here that people have not been protesting Trump's visiting per se. People have been protesting the rolling out of a state visit to him and the rolling out of a red carpet, including a visit with the monarch. There is a difference between a working visit and a state visit. And what a lot of the protesters are saying, what a lot of people are saying, is that Trump does not represent the kind of relationship that British people want to have with the American people, and that Trump is really, in many ways, the opposite of what a good relationship between the two countries ought to stand for.
I wanted to end, before Trump arrived in Britain, he insulted London's first Muslim mayor, Sadiq Khan, after Sadiq Khan called out Trump's divisive far-right policies, tweeting, "Khan reminds me very much of our dumb and incompetent mayor of NYC, de Blasio, who's also done a terrible job, only half his height," Trump tweeted. He also called Khan a stone-cold loser after arriving in London. We'd like to end with the mayor of London himself, Sadiq Khan, speaking on Sky News Monday.
I think it's important for our allies to be here to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings. We're going to have good relations with the USA, but I don't think we should be rolling out the red carpet. I don't think this should be a state visit. And why do I say that? I think our closest ally is akin to a best friend. And the thing about a best friend is, of course, you stand shoulder to shoulder with them at times of adversity, but you've got to call them out when you think they're wrong. And there are so many things about President Donald Trump's policies that are the antithesis of our values in London, but also our values as a country.
That was Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Priya Gopal, we want to thank you very much for being with us, university lecturer in the Faculty of English at the University of Cambridge. When we come back, as Trump threatens a 5% tariff on all Mexican imports to go up to 25% by October, Senate Republicans appear poised to block him. Stay with us.
This is England. God save the Queen. Now she ain't made for me, but she keeps my paper green. Plus we neighbors see on this little island where we're all surviving. Politeness mixed with violence. This is England, the bridge we're living in. A kitchery simmering, women in hijabs, syringe pop stars, and the promise of a patella's a man you star. Where the money you make and the man you are standing opposite, so we drink too hard. The banks rob you and the news is half the truth, wrapped up in boobs and arse. Pigs hit kids so, bricks hit windows, and a high street burns with broken dreams and herb. Only thing you can't find in Tesco is that and a sense of worth. So hide behind the Benz or furs, go online to find friends or perf, but click the wrong site for a free trial, later detention first.
English Stand by Rhythm C. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to a growing standoff on Capitol Hill as Senate Republicans appear poised to block President Trump's proposed tariffs on all Mexican goods. Mexican officials are in Washington, D.C. this week for talks with the Trump administration over the president's plan to impose a 5% tariff on all imported goods, which could increase to as much as 25%. Trump announced the tariffs over what he claims is Mexico's failure to stem the flow of Central American migrants into the United States. citing potentially devastating consequences to the U.S. economy. Senate Republicans defied the president Tuesday, announcing their opposition to the tariffs. This is Majority Leader Mitch McConnell speaking at a news conference.
There is not much support in my conference for tariffs, that's for sure. But we appreciate the opportunity. We had an opportunity at lunch to talk to a number of representatives from the White House about this particular strategy. I think I can safely say most of us hope that this Mexican delegation that's come up here and discussed the challenges at the border and what the Mexicans might be able to do to help us more than they have will be fruitful, and that these tariffs will not kick in.
Speaking from London Tuesday, President Trump responded to the possibility of Republicans blocking the tariffs.
No, I don't think they will do that. I think if they do, it's foolish. I want to see security at our border. I'm going to see great trade. I'm going to see a lot of things happening, and that is happening. And as you know, Mexico called. They want to meet. They're going to meet on Wednesday. Secretary Pompeo is going to be at the meeting, along with a few others that are very good at this, and we are going to see if we can do something. But I think it's more likely that the tariffs go on, and we'll probably be talking during the time that the tariffs are on and they're going to be paid.
Mexican officials are meeting with Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo today in Washington. For more, we're going to Portland, Oregon, to see Laura Carlson, the director of the Mexico City-based Americas program of the Center for International Policy. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Laura. Can you talk about what's happening here, the threat of President Trump, what he is accusing Mexico of, and Mexico's response?
This threat of imposing tariffs of 5% going up to 25% in October is economic blackmail. Essentially, what he's saying is that Mexico should do more to alleviate, and these are his words, the crisis of illegal immigration at the border. In the letter the statement that he put out regarding the tariffs, he says that these tariffs will be in place until Mexico has taken effective actions that will be determined by our discretion and our judgment. So it's not even clear exactly what Mexico is supposed to do and how they're trying to negotiate what's actually happening at the border. We have to remember that this characterization of a border crisis is essentially false. These are not unprecedented numbers, and this is not an unmanageable situation. What it is a manufactured crisis that Donald Trump is using for electoral purposes in order to create an image that immigration is the number one problem that the United States faces and mobilize an essentially racist and white supremacist base. This, as you can imagine, has not gone down well in Mexico. The first response of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador was to write a very strong letter to Donald Trump, really the strongest letter that we've seen yet, because he's been very careful about the U.S.-Mexico relationship, particularly for the trade and investment aspects involved. And he said, I am not a coward, I am not timid, and our approach to immigration is different. It involves stemming immigration in the countries of origin where people are being forced to flee. This is the situation we have now as they go into meetings. It's a macho move on the part of Donald Trump to say that he'll impose these tariffs, but he's gone out on the limb because, as we mentioned, he does not have the support of the Republican Party. And in fact, he doesn't have the support of especially the economists in his own cabinet.
And Laura, you mentioned that lack of support within the Republican Party. Senator Ted Cruz, for instance, who's always had a reputation as being extremely hard line on immigration, came out in opposition because obviously Texas, having the biggest part of the border with Mexico, also has the most benefit from trade with Mexico. And you're seeing politicians throughout Texas in an uproar over this proposal. We even have talk of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce suing the Trump administration over these tariffs. So has there been surprise in Mexico about this enormous response by even most conservative members of the Republican Party?
There hasn't really, because Mexicans know what apparently everyone except Donald Trump knows, which is that tariffs mostly affect consumers and importers in the United States. That's why the border states are so concerned about this, and the industrial and trade associations, from the Chamber of Commerce to the National Association of Manufacturers and the others that you mentioned, are immediately rushing to Washington to begin lobbying and saying, you've got to be kidding. You know, these are our livelihoods that you're talking about. Vertically integrated supply chains, especially in the automotive industry, that rely on Mexican parts, and their costs will automatically increase. So he's shooting himself in the foot, essentially, in order to make this statement that it's somehow Mexico's fault that Central American migrants are fleeing conditions that were largely created by U.S. policies coming up through Mexico and arriving at the border where, and this is again important, they are not entering the majority illegally. They are entering and requesting asylum, which is a procedure that's sanctioned under international law for people who are fleeing persecution.
Let's go to Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador speaking at a rally Friday.
And we will always defend our fellow migrants, and not just Mexican migrants, all of those who look for a new life out of necessity and leave for other places. They go walking because they don't have opportunities or jobs, or because in their places of origin there is much violence. All migrants deserve our respect, our understanding, and our fraternal hand. We are human beings.
So that's the Mexican president, AMLO. Laura Carlson, can you talk about the criticism of the president in the treatment of migrants, the violent repression that started before him, of course, but people are criticizing him for continuing, and especially with the Trump pressure?
Here we have the contradiction, and that is that we're getting this discourse particularly in response to this punitive criminalizing model that Donald Trump is trying to impose on Mexico. We're getting this discourse that we're going to go to the root causes of immigration with respect for human rights and a paradigm shift in terms of how migratory flows are handled in Mexico and in general, in which it would appear that Mexico would seek to be a leader in creating a new model, a more humane model to handle what's a phenomenon that's obviously here to stay, which is immigration on a global level. However, especially since January, February, and the threat to close the border by Donald Trump, we have been seeing something very different on the ground. Human rights groups that are reporting from the southern border are talking about increased raids. We've seen the deportation rate of Central Americans from Mexico double just since January to May. There's increased detention, and these are practices that were not common in Mexico before, although we've had a long history, particularly since the southern border plan in 2014, again with pressure from a U.S. government, of a crackdown. So we have, on the one hand, a discourse of a different approach, but in practice, we are seeing a crackdown. And the hope, of course, is that in these negotiations, we won't have any kind, whether public or behind the scenes, caving in to this punitive model, and we will see this other model that they've discussed of more human rights, more job visas, more opportunities for asylum, insisting that the United States deal with processing legal asylum seekers in its own country. We will see this other model go forward. But it's not happening so far, and organizations of civil society, we're watching very closely to see what does happen on the ground.
And one of the issues that AMLO raised shortly after his inauguration of the need for some kind of major initiative for economic development in Central America, some to actually deal with the root causes of what is leading to so many people fleeing the countries of Honduras, Salvador, and Guatemala. Any expectation that this will be part of the discussion, even though obviously the Trump administration is going in the opposite direction, cutting off aid to the Central American countries as punishment for their failure to keep their citizens from leaving?
This will definitely be part of the negotiations. How far they'll get, as you say, is another question. But this is the pillar of Mexico's immigration policy. They just announced the Integral Development Plan for Central America that was drawn up along with the UN Economic Commission, and it goes to the root causes, which is the major advantage that this plan has, and says what needs to be done so that forced migration can stop, that many of these people would prefer to remain in their own communities with their own families in their own country if it weren't for circumstances that were pushing them out of their countries. This is clearly a long-range plan to reduce immigration, but almost all experts agree that it's the only plan that could possibly work. Now, on the aid issue, we have to look very closely at any aid plan, especially that involves the United States government, in terms of where that aid is going. Donald Trump has threatened to cut off aid, and yet he's been willing to put more aid and support and training into going to Central American countries and bolstering a crackdown on their own people, making it more difficult for them to leave their own country, which is characteristic of an authoritarian state, and trying to prevent, again, immigration through this punitive criminalizing model. So when we talk about aid, we have to be sure we're talking about the kind of aid that goes to keeping people in communities, to recognizing their right to their own resources, to avoiding the kinds of mega projects that actually displace people. And that would be a real change in the model of U.S. aid to date. So we need those kinds of programs that would go to the root causes of immigration, but they have to be carefully designed between the United States and Mexico in order to really give people the option to have healthy and dignified livelihoods in their own countries.
What do you understand is going on right now in Washington, Laura? Pompeo and Pence meeting with the Mexican delegation, and also describe just returning from Tijuana and the report you're coming out with.
Well, right now there's a very delicate set of negotiations going on because so much has to do with Donald Trump's ego, and that is not negotiated under the normal rules and procedures of international relations. There's a strong possibility that the 5% tariff will go into place as a result of this, which won't end up in cutting off orders to Mexico, but will end up in a bump in prices for the most part to U.S. consumers. Mexicans are trying to get a commitment that there will be support for the development program in Central America and in southern Mexico, and they're expecting a negotiation to come out of that. So what happens is, and the biggest point of concern is whether Mexicans will cave in terms of more punitive measures for asylum seekers when they're in Mexico. I was just in Tijuana, and the situation is reaching a humanitarian crisis there because essentially there are 8,000 people that have been returned under what's called the Remain in Mexico program, a program that the Mexican government should never have accepted from the United States, where people who have already requested asylum in the United States are returned to Mexico to await their hearings. That can take up to a year. So those numbers are growing. We're having new migrants coming in, and we're having people being deported at increasing rates, mostly Mexicans, back to Tijuana. So there's streams of immigrants coming into border towns across the Mexican border on the Mexican side. There's no support, virtually no support from the governments. And although civil society on both sides of the border is doing a heroic job of taking care of these mostly desperate families from Central America, something's got to give. Increasing this punitive criminalizing model, forcing Mexico to accept more asylum seekers from the United States will only make that situation worse. And then the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing, the deaths of the children, which has happened on both sides of the border, the detention centers and inhumane conditions will increase.
We want to thank you very much, Laura Carlson, for joining us, Director of the Mexico City-based Americas Program of the Center for International Policy. When we come back, we'll look at the violence faced by transgender women in the U.S. after a trans asylum seeker in Texas and a black trans woman in Dallas died this weekend. Stay with us.
Sale a caminar y a inhalar tranquilidad y amor, pero sentí el odio del estado solitario y una voz que dice que vamos a hacer. En México sale a caminar y a inhalar tranquilidad y amor, pero sentí el odio.
Mexico by Mex Risi. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to look at the Trump administration's deadly treatment of transgender asylum seekers in immigration prisons after a transgender woman died after being released from ICE custody Saturday. Johanna Medina, a 25-year-old transgender asylum seeker from El Salvador, died at an El Paso, Texas hospital this weekend after spending 7 weeks in immigration jail. According to several LGBT groups and advocates who knew her, Medina had sought medical treatment for nearly 2 months for complications related to HIV/AIDS before finally being transferred to the hospital last week. She died 4 days later.
Johanna Medina is believed to be the second transgender migrant to die in or after being released from ICE custody since Trump became president. The other is Roxana Hernandez Rodriguez, a 33-year-old Honduran transgender woman who died while in ICE custody in May of last year. An autopsy revealed she was physically assaulted prior to her death. For more, we're going to Phoenix, Arizona, where we're joined by Isa Noyola. She's deputy director at Mi Gente, the former deputy director at the Transgender Law Center, and a transgender and immigrant rights activist herself. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Isa, can you describe what you understand were the circumstances of her death?
The circumstances of Johanna are the same circumstances that so many trans women inside immigration detention centers are facing, which is cruel and inhumane treatment and human torture. And so we understand that immigration customs enforcement has seen trans women, immigrant trans women, as disposable. We see it through the ways that they're placing trans women through administrative segregation and also denying them medical care and medical treatment. And Johanna is just another example, another extreme story of so much loss and so much pain that someone has endured, even after the long and arduous journey of arriving to the border. And so Johanna has left her hometown with so much hope of El Salvador, her country, and she had so much hope for a better life, to live her life fully, authentically as a trans Latina immigrant woman, and only to be met with violence at the border and discrimination, and even more violence inside detention facility.
I'm wondering if you could talk of your experience with refugees who are coming, who are trying to get into the United States. One group in Honduras, Catrachas, which is a lesbian feminist organization, has estimated that between 2013 and 2017, they found 34 cases of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people who had been deported back to Honduras and then were later killed. And what the situation is for trans folks, especially in Honduras and Central America right now.
The climate for trans people around globally is alarming. The level of violence has always existed. It is now recently being studied, researched, and documented by the media. But being in the trans community and doing this work for so many years, doing local immigrant rights work for trans people in San Francisco at ELA para Translatinas, we always understood that the violence surrounds our daily lives, violence surrounds the community, and one of the main push factors and reasons why trans people migrate, why trans people globally are seeking refuge, are seeking safety, are seeking a better place to live their lives and to have a chance, have a possibility of what everyone else has, what everyone else is living in terms of their dreams, in terms of their having access to healthcare, having access to housing, having access to education, having access to community, right? And so detention and immigration immigration customs enforcement have been hell-bent on denying basic human rights to our community. And so the phenomena of violence and murder is not a new thing. There's no uptick. It has always existed. Now there's an acknowledgement of it. But the reality is that Central American trans people, that queer LGBT plus folks have faced in their countries are the same that are experiencing in Mexico, in Asia, in all over the continent of Africa. And so we understand that the violence is one of the main factors of why trans people are marginalized, why trans people are placed in vulnerable situations where they have very limited choices. And so when you understand that then there's a systemic issue involved when you get to the border, right, and then you're returned back, people are still going to find possibilities to exist and to live.
A report released last month by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists revealed that since 2012, ICE has used solitary confinement as a routine punishment for thousands of immigrants and asylum seekers locked up in immigration jails across the country. Immigration officers repeatedly used isolation cells to punish gay, transgender, and disabled immigrants for their identities. This is a clip from an NBC interview with two trans women who were held in isolation while in ICE custody. In this clip, we hear from Dulce Rivera, a trans woman from Honduras who was kept in solitary for 11 months while in ICE custody and attempted suicide. But first, Jocelyn Mendez, a trans woman from Nicaragua who was put in solitary twice for a total of 9 days.
And well, the truth is, what I went through in there is something I don't even wish on my worst enemy. It's horrible. I felt like I really didn't know what was going to happen to me. I felt afraid. I felt that I couldn't even breathe. And at the beginning, I began to scream and scream where they locked me up. I told them, release me. I can't stand it. I am short of breath.
I asked them for help. I told them, I need to see a psychologist. I need to see a psychologist. And what happened is that the guard's response was no. So then I decided to tie a piece of blanket to the window above. And I completely covered the door outside so that no one was seeing what was happening inside the room. I made a lasso. I hung myself. So it's something psychological, mental, that it affected me in being in that place. So disgusting and horrible.
That's Dulce Rivera, and before that, Jocelyn Mendez, describing their experience in solitary. Issa, as we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about Johanna's death. She was held in an all-male detention facility, and if you could describe these facilities that you've entered and seen and what you're calling for.
I want to clear something up also. I just want to be very, very clear that Immigration Customs Enforcement is responsible for the death of not just Johanna Medina and Roxana Hernandez, but also Victoria Arellano in 2007, who was handcuffed to her bed pleading for her life and was an HIV-positive trans woman. So ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, has to be held accountable for the deaths of these trans women and all the deaths that happen inside detention facilities, and Customs Border Patrol has to be held accountable for the deaths that are occurring at the border. Johanna, her experience that she had at the Otero facility is one that exists, the experience that exists in all of the 200 plus facilities that exist around the country. And that is one of human rights violations and denial of access to medical treatment and to basic human dignity. The ways that trans women are classified by Immigration Customs Enforcement is based on genitalia, is based on a classification that does not align with our community, that is dehumanizing us from the very beginning. And Immigration Customs Enforcement does not make any excuses about that. They are very clear and adamant that trans people inside detention are not human beings, and they've demonstrated that time and time again. And Johanna, her experience is one of many of trans people who have been placed at whether it's administrative segregation or whether it's with other in the male housing units, right, where sexual assault is experienced, and one of the highest levels for trans people inside detention.
Isa Noyola, I want to thank you for being with us. Deputy Director at Mejente, the former Deputy Director of Transgender Law Center, transgender and immigrant rights activist, speaking to us from Phoenix, Arizona. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we continue our conversation about the violence faced by transgender women by looking at the spate of killings of black trans women in the United States. The body of 26-year-old Shayna Lindsay was recovered Saturday from a lake in northeast Dallas. Police said they are investigating her death as a homicide. She's the third transgender black woman killed in Dallas since October, including the high-profile death of Mulaisia Booker just 2 weeks ago. Another Dallas trans woman was stabbed multiple times in April but survived. The city's police chief, Renee Hall, addressed the spate of violence in a news conference Monday.
The Dallas Police Department has reached out to the FBI because, as we know, this is the second individual who is transgender who is deceased in our community. And we are concerned. We are actively and aggressively investigating this case, and we have reached out to our federal partners to assist us in these efforts.
The Dallas police chief. Trans rights activists say the violence in Dallas is indicative of the larger threat to black transgender women. At least 8 black trans women have been murdered in the United States this year. According to the Human Rights Campaign, at least 26 transgender murders were recorded last year, although it's likely the actual number is much higher. The majority of those were black transgender women. For more, we're joined by Ashley Marie Preston, media personality, civil rights activist. She made history as the first transgender editor-in-chief of a national publication, Wear Your Voice magazine, as well as the first openly trans person to run for state office in California. Welcome to Democracy Now! Thank you for joining us from Los Angeles. Ashley, can you talk about this latest death in Dallas? Can you talk about what happened to Shayna?
I think what we're seeing is an ongoing trend of a lack of access for black trans women. I think there's a larger conversation that should be had around our experiences at the intersections of race, gender, and socioeconomic disparity. What often happens is that black trans women have difficult times attaining employment, housing, legal aid, health care, social support, and anything that would set us up to thrive. And so we're left to defend ourselves on the margins of society. And from what it appears in Dallas, she's just another who had to deal with that disparity by herself.
I want to ask about Mulaisia Booker, a 23-year-old black transgender woman who was fatally shot in Dallas last month. A month before she was killed, a cell phone video of a crowd physically attacking Booker as she lay on the ground made headlines. Police say men in the video were shouting homophobic slurs at Booker, who eventually got away with the help of a group of women. Authorities say there's nothing connecting the perpetrator of last month's attack, Edward Thomas, to her shooting as of now. I'm wondering your thoughts.
That is correct. I think going back to it, this is a systemic issue. I think oftentimes law enforcement address it as if it is a isolated incident, but the issue, it really is a lack of support and safety for black trans women. I could only speak from a first-person perspective. When I came from Kentucky at 19 years old, I got a job. I transitioned on the job, and I was fired because I was being harassed and
and I ended up becoming homeless. I was on the streets of Hollywood. I had to engage in survival sex work, and I ended up using methamphetamine as a social lubricant to be able to navigate everything that I had to do in the name of survival. What I noticed when I was on the streets of Hollywood is that whenever there would be deaths of Black trans women and we saw the uptick of violence, law enforcement, as a means of helping us, would actually target us, and we would be profiled, and we face more violence while incarcerated for those of us whose that's a part of their story. So the issue is that our law enforcement are looking at Black trans women as women who are breaking the law instead of looking at the laws that are breaking Black trans women. And so I think it's an opportunity for our federal, state, and local officials to be more intentional about implementing policies that are going to serve Black trans women. When you're looking at resources, if you're trying to attain employment, that's not going to help you if you have a hard time gaining access to housing. If you're trying to gain access to housing, that does nothing for you if you're experiencing intimate partner violence. And so what we need are programs that are prepared to address dual disenfranchisement at the same time.
And Ashley, you started a campaign called Thrive Over 35. Can you talk about what that is?
So Thrive Over 35 is an opportunity for us to reimagine our lives as Black trans women outside of a casket or a jail cell. I feel that what happens often when we're talking about the deaths of Black trans women, we're caught up in this trauma porn around how we die and at whose hands we die at. But it's an opportunity for us to take a look and examine the barriers that place us in front of the barrel of the gun. So in Thrive Over 35, I talk about the lack of access to employment, the lack of access to education, the lack of access to health care, the lack of access to legal aid. I talk about the fact that even in communities that have larger movements in play, like for women, when we're not seen as women, we don't have access to those movements. In the African American community, sometimes LGBTQ issues are seen as secondary issues, so we don't have the protection there oftentimes. When we're looking at the LGBTQIA umbrella, there are individuals who use their sexuality as a shield to absolve them of the responsibility of dismantling sexist, racist, and transphobic policies and systems. And so Thrive Over 35 is an opportunity for Black trans women and brown trans women to show up for ourselves and to be a beacon of hope of light for one another. And it's also an opportunity to engage our would-be allies to figure out how they can do the work to help liberate us.
Ashley, last month, the Trump administration announced a change in HUD policy that would allow homeless shelters and other facilities that receive federal housing money to deny access to transgender people. The rule also lets programs house transgender individuals alongside others of their birth sex, refusing to let them share facilities with people of the same gender identity. If you can comment on this, and then what you feel is most important needs to happen to protect the trans community.
I think when we're looking at human rights, we have to realize that trans people are seen as less than human. And that really broke my heart when I heard the story about HUD and the Trump administration, because that was what happened to me when I became homeless, as I mentioned, at 19 years old. Women's shelters wouldn't accept me because of my assigned gender at birth. And I was so desperate, I was willing to be housed with men. Like, I was that far down in the gutter. And men's shelters turned me away because I obviously read female. And so I think what it really is going to require from our government and our state and local officials is an intentionality to show up for us. Don't just give us the scraps that fall from the table of some of these other programs, but really be intentional about showing up for Black trans women. There's an opportunity for us to create a task force, actually. I know in California, there's a task force that addresses homelessness, and it looks at the different barriers to access that homeless people have. We need to do that on the federal level for Black trans women. And it's one of the main reasons why I endorsed presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren, is because she's one of the few candidates who are actually breaking down all of those needs and tackling them head on. We don't need more officials in office who are going to be intellectually lazy. We need officials who are going to do the work, lean more into the nuance instead of the noise, and are going to ask the community directly impacted what it is that we need to stay alive, to grow strong, and to thrive.
Ashley Marie Preston, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Civil rights activist, media personality, made history as the first transgender editor-in-chief of a national publication, Wear Your Voice magazine, as well as the first openly trans person to run for state office in California. Thanks so much for being with us. That does it for our show. Our condolences to our Democracy Now! Colleague, John Randolph, on the death of his father, Robert Randolph. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Hani Massoud, Trina Nadura, Tay Maria Studio. Special thanks to Libby Rainey and Maria Terracena. Mike DeFilippo and Miguel Noguera are engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Miriam Barnard, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ishmael Darrow. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.